The shuttle shuddered as it broke through the upper atmosphere of Vellatros 4, a bluish-green planet swirled with mist and jagged mountain spines. Inside the cramped cockpit, Captain Drazul of the Varn Dominion frowned at the readouts. A minor atmospheric disturbance, nothing more. He adjusted course and glanced at the passenger reflected in the side panel's sleight of build, dark hair, sweat gathering at his temple despite the cool cabin temperature. "Are you trembling, Brandon?" Drazul asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and amusement. Brandon Gray kept his eyes forward. "Just airsick. You've crossed 2 star systems, but descending through some clouds makes you ill," Brandon shrugged. "It's not the clouds, it's the smell. Your filtration system keeps pumping out that spice scent, reminds me of my grandma's closet." Drazul tilted his head. "That's the scent of Varn ceremonial oil. It's considered invigorating." "Yeah, well, invigorating or not, it makes me want to hurl." Drazul didn't reply immediately. He simply studied the human. Thin by Varn standards, pale, very little visible muscle mass, no exosuit. No respirator, despite the planetary surface requiring one for most species. Just a soft human wrapped in a light jacket and cargo pants, boots already scuffed. Drazul had reviewed Earth physiology reports. Fragile bones, vulnerable skin, prone to temperature swings and a bizarre range of allergies. He had wondered why the Dominion had assigned one of them to the crash retrieval mission. Probably a clerical misfire. Or perhaps the humans had misunderstood the danger. Still, orders were orders. They landed at the edge of a rocky outcrop overlooking a deep gorge. Smoke curled in the distance, thin, black, and streaking toward the clouds. Drazul keyed open the hatch and descended first, his boots crunching into the gravel. Brandon followed, a duffel slung over one shoulder. He adjusted the strap and looked around. "Where's the beacon?" Drazul gestured toward the valley. 3 kilometers east. Our pilot went down during last week's geomagnetic storm. The pod's partially buried. We need to extract him, still transmitting life signs. Barely. Brandon squinted at the terrain. "That's a steep drop. You were briefed. The terrain is unstable, heat pockets, sink zones, radiation pockets at lower levels." "Yeah, I read the file," Brandon muttered and started down the slope. Drazul followed, his long limbs making the descent easier. He kept watching the human, expecting him to slip or pull a muscle. But Brandon moved with a methodical steadiness, bracing on rocks, adjusting his footing. Not fast, but efficient. An hour in, they reached the valley floor. The air shimmered with heat. Brandon unzipped his jacket and pulled a respirator from his pack, strapping it on without complaint. Drazul checked his scanner. 200 meters west, below that ridge. Brandon nodded and adjusted course without waiting. When they reached the pod, it was evident how bad the crash had been. The impact had crumpled the forward hull, half burying the structure in a slope of shale and red dust. A trail of scorched earth marked its path through the valley. Drazul knelt by the hatch. Hull integrity compromised, internal temperatures unstable. "He's alive, but fading." Brandon dropped the duffel and pulled out a compact drill. "We cutting through?" "You don't have the strength for that." "Let me." Brandon was already drilling. The tool whined as it punched through the damaged plate. After a few seconds, Drazul stepped back, surprised at the man's stubbornness. "Your kind," Drazul said, "are not known for field strength." Brandon didn't look up. "We adapt." They breached the side panel after 15 minutes. Heat radiated from the opening. Inside, the Varn pilot was pinned by a section of collapsed bulkhead. His breathing was shallow. One leg bent at an unnatural angle. Brandon moved first. "Hold that panel up," he said. Drazul hesitated. "It weighs over 70 kilograms. I said hold it." "I'll get him." Drazul complied, bracing the panel with both arms. Brandon crawled in, checked the pilot's pulse, then slid his arms under the wounded body. He grunted. The pilot was taller and heavier than him, Varn muscle mass and armor plating, but Brandon didn't stop. Gritting his teeth, he inched backward, dragging the pilot with him. Once clear, Brandon laid the pilot gently on a thermal pad and pulled a med pack from his duffel. He sprayed a coagulant over the bleeding leg and secured it with a temporary brace. "We need evac," Brandon said. Drazul checked his comm. "Storm's building, transport window is closing. If we don't move now, we're stranded." "Then help me lift him." Drazul tilted his head again. "You can't carry him. His weight exceeds human limits." Brandon looked up, eyes hard. "Watch me." He adjusted the pilot's weight across his shoulders in a fireman's carry, grunted at the strain, then started walking. Drazul followed, astonished. Brandon's legs trembled within minutes. Sweat poured down his face. Every step was a battle against the shifting terrain and the weight threatening to buckle him. But he didn't stop. Not when the shale turned to loose sand. Not when a tremor rolled through the ground and dust choked the air. Not when he tripped on a jagged rock and scraped his knee raw. After 20 minutes, Drazul stepped forward. "You'll collapse if you go on. Then catch me if I do." Brandon's voice was hoarse. His arms were wrapped tight around the Varn pilot's torso, his back strained to the edge of failure. But he kept moving. They reached the ridge just as the sky turned sulfur yellow. The wind began to howl. Drazul activated the beacon flare. Within minutes, a Dominion evac shuttle descended, kicking up dust in a blinding storm of grit. The hatch opened and medics rushed out. Brandon staggered to the edge of the ramp, dropped to his knees as the medics took the pilot. One checked on him. "You need attention." "I'm fine," Brandon said, then promptly collapsed. He woke hours later in the Dominion cruiser's medbay, hooked up to fluids, his back wrapped in compression bands. Pain flared across his shoulders and spine. One of the medics was talking quietly to Drazul near the monitor. He tore muscle fibers in the lower back. Badly strained ligaments. "Not permanent damage, but he needs weeks of rest." "He carried 90 kilograms through unstable terrain," Drazul said. "No exosuit, no assist. He shouldn't have been able to." Brandon opened one eye. "Still here, you know," Drazul approached, folding his arms. "You were not expected to survive this mission." "Yeah, well, I wasn't expecting your pilot to be heavier than a fridge. You risked your life, for someone you never met." Brandon turned his head slightly. He was breathing. That was enough. Drazul studied him in silence. For the first time, he saw not frailty but something else, an unnerving, stubborn resilience. He remembered how the human had said, "We adapt." Maybe that was true. Maybe that was what made them dangerous. "Rest," Drazul said finally. "You've earned it." Brandon closed his eyes again. "Next time, I'm bringing a stretcher." Drazul left without another word, but as he walked the corridor of the cruiser, the image of the frail human carrying a Varn pilot alone across a broken valley stayed with him. It would stay with him for a long time. Brandon woke up to the sound of dripping. Not the rhythmic hiss of med fluid or the soft ping of vital monitors, actual dripping. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to indirect amber light. The ceiling of the Dominion medical bay was gone, replaced by a dome of translucent panels streaked with condensation. He shifted and immediately regretted it. His back spasmed like it had been whipped with cold wire. "You are not cleared to move." The voice came from somewhere above and to the left. Brandon turned his head just enough to see a creature perched on a low rail beside the bed. It was the size of a child, covered in overlapping plates that glistened like wet stone. Its eyes, 6 of them, blinked in alternating pairs. "You're not the medic," Brandon muttered. "I am the biomechanic. They assigned me to monitor your tissue reconstruction." The other one had to recalibrate after you disrupted his predictive charting. Brandon blinked. "I what?" "You forced a recalibration. Your recovery curve deviated wildly from all projected outcomes. The model assumed you would be immobile for 3 cycles. You began shifting after only 1 cycles. 18-hour intervals." Brandon sighed and lay back, wincing. "That's not impressive. My spine feels like someone tried to fold it in half." "That's because someone did." He turned his head again. "You have a name." "Triz of the Keth." "Brandon. Of nowhere in particular." Triz dropped from the rail and scuttled closer, 3 limbs supporting a medical rig that hovered beside him like a lazy balloon. Tubes ran from it to Brandon's side, one of them feeding a dull green liquid into his arm. "Your musculature is inefficient," Triz said, "but your cellular repair rate exceeds expectations. Your kind shouldn't be able to endure full spinal compression loads without neural degradation. Appreciate the compliment." "It's not a compliment. It's an anomaly." Brandon tried sitting up again. This time the pain was duller, more like a warning than a punishment. The compression bands around his lower back flexed slightly to accommodate the movement. "What's in the tube?" "Protein strands harvested from Vellatran fireworms. They promote rapid collagen synthesis. Also mild hallucinogens. You may experience visual irregularities." "Neat. So if I see 6 of you, I won't panic." "There are 6 of me. You're seeing correctly." Brandon raised an eyebrow, then realized Triz was probably being literal. He sighed and looked around. The medical bay had been relocated to what looked like a mobile field unit. The walls shimmered faintly, a sign they were still within magnetic shielding. Outside, he could hear wind thrumming against the outer shell. "Why aren't we on the cruiser?" "Atmospheric instability grounded the primary vessel. We're in a surface camp while they repair the stabilizers." Brandon rubbed his eyes. "How long have I been out?" 17 hours. "And the pilot?" "Stabilized. Internal hemorrhaging reversed." He regained consciousness and asked for smoked scarn fruit. "We assume that's a positive sign." Brandon swung his legs over the side of the bed, ignoring the flare of pain that shot up his back. Triz made a noise that sounded like a cross between a clicking lock and a sigh. "You will tear your recovery pads. I just need to walk, not far, just enough to prove I can." "To whom?" Brandon hesitated. "Myself, I guess." Triz extended a lower limb, which uncoiled into a support brace that clamped gently around Brandon's bicep. "Then walk. But if you rupture anything, I'm filing a report." They moved slowly through the corridor, which was more like a tunnel of flexible mesh that adjusted to their weight. The air inside was cool, tinged with a sterile metallic tang. Brandon counted each step, trying not to favor one side. At the far end, a transparent door slid open to reveal a communal chamber. Several Varn officers stood around a projection table, gesturing through layers of data. Drazul stood slightly apart from the others, arms crossed. Brandon took a breath and stepped in. One of the Varn turned toward him. "You are not permitted in this sector." Drazul raised a hand. "Let him stay." The others returned to their work without comment. Brandon sat on the edge of a crate, wiping his forehead. "Medbay said I'm technically upright," he said. Drazul nodded but didn't look at him. "This is a tactical planning room, not a lounge." "Then it's lucky I'm not carrying coffee." Drazul did not respond, but his gaze finally shifted toward Brandon. "The pilot asked for you." Brandon's posture tightened. "What for?" "He wanted to see the one who carried him." "I didn't do it for thanks." "That's not what he said. He asked if you were injured. I told him yes. He insisted on giving you one of his ration tokens." Brandon blinked. "What do I do with that?" "You can exchange it for a favor during the next Dominion cycle." "I don't even know what a Dominion cycle is." "You'll learn." They sat in silence for a moment. The projection table flickered, displaying terrain overlays and heat traces. Brandon leaned forward. "Those red zones are those geothermal vents." "Yes, they've become unstable. The storm that grounded our cruiser also activated tectonic fault lines." Brandon frowned. "You've got people down there," salvage crews. "They're retrieving data cores from an old relay station." "We've already lost 2 drones, and you're still sending people. It's necessary." Brandon rubbed his shoulder. "You've got suits that can handle the heat." "Not for long durations." Brandon looked at the map again, then at Drazul. "You could pressurize the drop point from here. Use a thermal inversion to create a buffer zone." Drazul turned toward him slowly. "You understand thermal inversion management. I worked in wildfire suppression back home. Different fire, same rules. You're not trained for Varn-grade atmospheric reactions." "No. But I've survived worse with less." Drazul watched him for a moment, then gestured toward the table. "Show me." Brandon stood, limping slightly, and began adjusting the overlays. He shifted humidity layers, recalibrated vent strengths, and tapped a point near the western ridge. There. If you vent a coolant burst here, it'll reverse the updraft flow for about 10 minutes, enough to get your crew to the data core and back. Drazul stared at the projection. That might work. It will, Brandon said. Just don't use the green coolant. It reacts with sulfur compounds. Learned that the hard way. Drazul gave a short nod. I'll authorize the adjustment. Brandon leaned back against the wall, sweat now beading along his brow again. Triz reappeared behind him with a noise that sounded suspiciously like a groan. You've reopened the lateral tier. Brandon closed his eyes. Totally worth it. Triz jabbed a limb at him. Back, now. As Brandon limped away, Drazul watched him go. The others returned to their overlays, discussing thermal balances and equipment loads. None of them asked why a human who could barely stand had just saved an entire salvage crew. They'd already stopped being surprised. The camp's environmental dome groaned under a pressure gust, rattling the overhead braces as the storm outside surged briefly and then passed. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Inside the field medbay, the air smelled faintly of ionized dust and sterilized bandages. Brandon sat cross-legged on a padded bench, his back wrapped in pale gray support mesh that flexed slightly with his movements. His shirt hung open at the shoulders, sweat staining the collar. Triz moved around him with deliberate speed, adjusting the tension on the mesh while muttering in short, clipped syllables. That ligament was nearly liquefied. You're lucky your body didn't overwrite the tissue with scar mass. Brandon winced as a cold patch was pressed against the base of his spine. Feels like it did. I can barely bend without something popping. Then stop bending. You aren't a hinge. Nearby, a small console chirped and Triz flicked a tendril toward it. A second later, he gave a low, irritated rasp. Drazul wants you in the operations bay, again. Brandon stretched a leg out slowly. What for this time? More geothermal heroics? He didn't specify. But he included the phrase immediate compliance, which I believe you humans interpret as either urgency or sarcasm. Depends on tone. What was his tone? Varn don't use tone. We use intent. Brandon stood with a grunt and reached for his boots. Well, his intent can wait 30 seconds. I'm not limping in barefoot. Triz didn't argue, but his 6 eyes blinked in what might have been exasperation. Brandon tightened the bootlaces, adjusted the support wrap under his shirt, and took a careful breath. Still hurts. Only when I'm upright, or sitting, or breathing. Good. That means the nerves are still functioning. Brandon gave him a sideways glance. You Keth folks have a wild definition of encouragement. Triz didn't follow him out. The corridor was quiet, the usual hum of atmospheric regulators punctuated by the occasional shuttle engine spinning up in the distance. The storm had weakened since the previous day, though the haze outside the dome still gave everything a jaundiced tint. The operations bay was smaller than it had looked before, more compact when not filled with scanning projections and tactical overlays. A single chair was pulled up to a narrow table where Drazul stood beside a cylindrical object the size of a small drum. You're late, Drazul said without turning. I'm injured. You're healing, painfully. Drazul tapped the cylinder. This is a Varn field compensator. You'll wear it. Brandon walked closer. Does it come with a manual? No. Of course not. Drazul lifted the device and handed it to him. It was heavier than expected, metal-ridged and faintly warm. A harness unfolded from the bottom. Strap it to your lower back. It redistributes load-bearing stress to your hips and legs. It will allow limited lifting without spinal strain. Brandon held it up. This exists and you let me carry a pilot without it. You didn't ask. I was busy not dying. Drazul didn't respond. Brandon strapped it on, hissing slightly as the harness adjusted itself. The weight shifted downward immediately. His spine felt less compressed. Not bad. It's standard for Varn Storm medics. We assumed your physiology wouldn't tolerate the neural interface. Well, Tell your assumptions they owe me 3 missed vertebrae. Drazul gestured toward the hatch. Follow me. They passed through a narrow corridor that led to a lower access tunnel. Brandon hadn't been down this way before. The walls were lined with equipment racks and storage lockers. The air was cooler, more metallic. A faint vibration trembled through the floor plates. Where are we going? To the communications chamber. Brandon raised an eyebrow. You're letting me near your comms. What if I call for pizza and tell them the planet's name is unpronounceable? You aren't here to transmit. You're here to explain. The chamber was circular, coated in thin sheets of dark alloy that absorbed light. In the center, a half-sphere projection field flickered with static. 3 Varn stood around it, each with the dark gray insignia of Dominion logistics. Their eyes followed Brandon as he entered. Unreadable, Drazul spoke first. This is the human who retrieved Specialist Core. None of the Varn responded. One turned slightly, arms still crossed. Brandon gave a small wave. Hi. The one closest to the projection stepped forward. We analyzed the retrieval footage. The terrain was unstable. Heat levels exceeded survival tolerances. Your species is not rated for that exposure. Brandon's shoulders lifted slightly. Must have missed that memo. You should not have been capable of carrying him unaided. Guess I am. The second officer leaned in, narrowing their eyes. You tore connective fibers to the point of near rupture. We reviewed your med scans. Your body prioritized movement over preservation. That's what bodies do when someone's dying. There was no directive, no obligation, you had no personal stake. Brandon looked at the projection field. Yeah, that's kind of the point. The third officer finally spoke. We do not understand. Brandon looked at Drazul. Is this a tribunal or a weird thank you party? They are attempting to understand motive. I didn't do it for motive. I did it because someone needed help. If you need a reason for that, I don't have one that'll make it look smart. The first officer tapped a control and the projection field shifted. It now displayed a new schematic and Earth-based shuttle, smaller than Dominion models, floating above a blue planet. We have begun reevaluating human field capabilities. Your physiological limits are inconsistent with observed behavior. Brandon crossed his arms. Yeah, we're not great at following rules, especially the ones written by biology. Drazul gestured toward the projection. They want to present your report to the Dominion's Envoy Council. As evidence? Evidence of what? That your species is either suicidal or indispensable. Brandon gave a short laugh. That's the most accurate summary I've heard all week. The officers turned away, murmuring among themselves in low frequencies. After a moment, they left silently, one after the other. The projection faded. Drazul didn't move. You've caused disruption. I tend to do that. Not all disruptions are negative. Brandon stretched his back. The compensator hummed softly as it adjusted again. So what now? You promote me to honorary storm medic. No, you return to your own sector. The Dominion has lifted your restriction. You're cleared for departure. Brandon froze. Wait, you're sending me home. You've completed your assignment. Your actions have been noted. Brandon looked around the chamber once more, then down at the harness. I thought I'd be stuck here another few days. You exceeded expectations. Even your own. Brandon hesitated. And the pilot, he's recovering. He says he doesn't remember the fall, only the heat, but he remembers you. Brandon nodded once. Good. Later that cycle, as the dome retracted and the atmosphere cleared, Brandon stood on the landing pad beside the transport shuttle. Triz appeared beside him, carrying a sealed container. What's that? Compressed ration core from the pilot, contains preserved scarn fruit. He said you earned it. Brandon took it with a grin. Smells like overripe melon and burnt socks. Then it's authentic. They stood in silence for a moment as the shuttle's ramp lowered. You'll be returning to your human sector? Yeah, I've got a follow-up scan scheduled. Might finally get that disc bulge looked at. Triz blinked twice. You should consider rest, actual rest, not the kind where you lift pilots uphill. Brandon stepped onto the ramp, then looked back. Tell Drazul thanks for the back brace and the unexpected respect. Triz tilted his head. He didn't do it out of sentiment. I know. That's what makes it better. The shuttle lifted gently, engines humming against the windless air. Below, the camp grew smaller, its lights flickering under the thinning clouds. Inside the cabin, Brandon leaned back against the padded seat, legs stretched out, the scarn fruit container resting on his stomach. He closed his eyes and breathed in slowly. The pain in his back was still there, dull but constant, but he was upright, still moving, still adapting, as always.